All right, welcome. My name is Derek Radney. I'm a pastor of Trinity in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and this is the AMR sort of General Assembly recap. We had the 53rd General Assembly that finished pretty early today, before dinner on Thursday night of General Assembly. We have a new stated clerk in the Presbyterian Church in America under Fred Greco. We had 90 overtures come to the General Assembly this year, the most we've ever had.
By a lot.
By a lot.
Yeah.
We probably get through that business. We had Clickergate, a lot of problems with voting machines. We have two study committees that were continued to do their work, and we added a third study committee on top of that. So a lot of things took place at this General Assembly, but we thought we'd just take some time to just reflect a little bit on everything that went down. So I've got with me Geoff Ziegler from Western Springs.
Trinity is the church. Yep.
Yeah, Trinity. And Eric Bonkovsky at City Church in Richmond. And so Geoff is on the governing board of AMR, and Eric's on the content team of AMR with me. And so been helping with the vision statement and all the articles that have been written and the stuff we've been producing. So we're just going to take some time to reflect on the General Assembly. I thought I'd start with you, Geoff, and just ask you to share with us some of your thoughts on how the week went.
Sure. I think we've already mentioned the thing that probably everyone will be remembering and talking about. That's Clickergate, right? The fact that anytime we had to come to a decision that was at all close, it usually would have like voice vote or standing up, and then division would be called because no one would know exactly what was, and then we do the clicks. And so it seemed like, given that we had 90 overtures, two, study committees that were supposed to be big ones coming up, no one I think would have been predictive for saying, and every decision is going to take 15 minutes long.
Yeah.
That we would be doing this right now.
Yeah.
But I think what's kind of striking is that isn't what happened. That there was kind of a collaboration that I think took place.
And Clickergate offered to us this wonderful living analogy for Presbyterianism.
Right.
It's frustrating. It takes a long time. It requires lots of patience from everyone involved. And yet in the end, it works out pretty effectively.
And actually the slowness, the frustratingness was actually like Presbyterianism, I think actually works to our benefit. Like I think you had pointed out to me that, and kind of like in the same way that like if an entire town is dealing with some sort of disaster, they kind of come together. It did feel like we were kind of coming together around how are we going to do this?
And you heard that in the assembly hall, right? That as the votes were taking 3 minutes or 5 minutes long, guys were talking to each other, laughing about it in a way that was fostering this collegiality that's often absent from the assembly.
Yeah, yes. The potential frustration at maybe each other was being directed to a common enemy.
But I think, and I think that actually, like I said, one of the expectations was long. I think another bit of apprehension people were having is that GAs in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been a number that felt contentious, felt like we would kind of have increasingly disparate kind of positions that are kind of pulling us apart. I think people are feeling very discouraged. That is not what I would say leaving was my kind of experience, that it seemed there was more of a collaborative spirit, more of trust. I mean, if you think about some of the votes, they're like whether overtures, I'm pointing to you because Eric was on overtures, or just in the floor, almost all of the ones we kind of decided pretty broadly. And the decisions that we made, I can't think of times that we were really changing the boundaries at all. This was just kind of like trying to navigate some complicated stuff like original jurisdiction, something that, like, there's an example, like for 15 years, we've been talking about how to solve this part of the BCO where if a presbytery doesn't do what it's supposed to do, how do we get SJC to get involved? And we haven't figured it out. That came through. So it was a time where actually, if anything, I feel like trust maybe felt a little bit greater between us.
And I think that this year, as often happens with GA, there can be a high level of anxiety going into GA, whether that's felt by pastors or ruling elders or even people in the local congregations. I picked up on some of that and even had received questions about what's going to happen with this, or, what's the future of the PCA? And I think now on the backside of GA, we feel encouraged about the denomination because that anxiety ahead of time wasn't warranted.
Right.
What we discovered, in fact, was this higher level of trust and collaboration, working together.
Even something as simple as like the nominations, like the nominating committee did a lot of work, came with their nominations, and almost every single one, the denomination, like, okay, we trust you, we're going to go with that, which is different from how it's been in the last few years.
Yeah, there was a lot of deferring to the committees.
Yep.
Whether it was Overtures or RPR, for the most part, we agreed with everything they recommended.
That's right.
With one exception. Committee of Commissioners, there were a few questions and potential conflict, but for the most part, there was a lot of unity in the Committee of Commissioners, and then there was a lot of agreement by the floor with the Committee of Commissioners.
Which is how it has to work. There's no way that we on the floor can make all these decisions. We have to trust our committees to be able to do this well.
So despite all the noise kind of coming in, it seemed like actually people came in and were ready to trust each other and work together. That was a big thing.
Right.
And I would say it's not just we're trusting the committees, but those committees and the Committee of Commissioners are doing their important work of review and control too.
Yes.
And so it's not squashing or diminishing review and control, but it's allowing it to have its place in the midst of trust.
Yeah.
So this brings me to like another kind of reflection that I was having, where I feel like another thing you could see is the triumph of I guess you could say, statesmanship or being churchmen over online agitators. So, there's a lot of noise going on online with Twitter or X, or we want to call it, and of course, that always rewards the more contentious, the more polarizing, the more angry it gets. But what actually is happening here in the Presbytery, like I think about what happened at GA, what happened was a number of times the reason we were able to do what we did and have the level of trust that we're talking about is you had people doing some really good work, face-to-face work. So like, for example, Overtures, I think the most we've ever had was 63 and we had 90 here, right? And so no, it's like, how in the world are we going to get through it? Well, there were, I think Howie, a couple of guys that we know working together, working through how are we going to get a docket that makes sense? And also navigating, how are we going to navigate all of these questions related to the diaconal roles so that then the Overtures Committee, I think, felt like, yeah, this makes sense. This is good. They were able to move through that really quickly and effectively. Or I think, okay, go ahead.
I would add to that, like you mentioned statesmanship, but what's behind statesmanship is statesmen. Right.
Exactly.
It happens at an individual level, a personal level. And I don't think we need to name names, but there are some of the leaders of the denomination who live that out.
That's right.
And they do that in a relational way that rather than seeking to take someone down online, they're taking them out to a meal or they're hosting a dinner before the assembly starts to work through some of these issues.
Yep.
And I think when we're closing the distance on some of the contentious issues, that leads to effective work.
That's right. And this is one of the reasons why I think it was Howie Donahoe that wrote that article about trust for us, for our kind of theological vision. And you cannot do Presbyterianism without that. And the way that you develop trust is exactly that kind of thing, where it's that face to face. And so whether we're talking about that or there's, we've talked about original jurisdiction. This is something that we've been trying to figure out for 15 years. Well, you have two guys who are kind of figuring out a compromise, and that allows us as a denomination to be able to work together. So this is just that kind of thoughtful, slow, like unexciting hard work, as opposed to like when you have the months before GA, the only thing that we're really experiencing is the online chatter. And so it can feel like the voices there are actually the ones who are shaping things that are powerful. But I can think of even like an example, like there were some chatter online and emails and that kind of thing about trying to kind of do a maneuver today related to the whole deacon compromise and whatnot. It ended up being like you had one overture that was pulled out. No one even had a chance to speak to it because they didn't have any speeches. It was nothing. So you see the power and the strength of people working face to face and the ephemeral kind of nothingness of what's being just shouted online. And it was really helpful to see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think coming into the General Assembly, a lot of questions were raised about officers and the role of women in our church.
Yep.
And what we saw is essentially everyone saying where the PCA has been, we're comfortable with where we are.
Yes.
There were a lot of formal, like 40-5s filed throughout this year, and through review and control, those things were looked into by presbyteries. And then I know from RPR, they looked at those things. And what came out of all this is essentially a statement that we're okay, the boundaries are clear, and there are things that maybe need to get handled, but those can get handled on presbytery levels. and we trust each other. We're going to keep moving forward. And this really doesn't need to have the uproar that it had online.
Well, and I think even from the perspective of overtures, if you go back and look at some of the way that overtures were answered, a lot of the grounds that the overtures committee gave were, this is already addressed within the Constitution. You don't need to say anything additional because what we've said in our confession, in our Constitution as the church is enough.
Yes.
To serve the churches, to serve the Presbyterian.
We felt confidently Presbyterian, right? Like recognizing we have courts, we have structures, we have a book of church order, and this actually has the stability that we need to be able to navigate rather than having to change and react kind of reactively.
Yeah.
And I would say some of that is even related to the sheer number of overtures that we have. We've alluded to the fact that 90 overtures came before the Overtures Committee, which is far away more than we've had before. And part of what the Overtures Committee did intentionally, and I think wisely, was to say, we can't fully discuss and deliberate on all of these. So a number were answered by referring back to the Presbyterians, were answered in the negative. And that has the effect of saying, what we have is enough.
Yeah.
Confidently Presbyterian, we're confidently confessional, and we don't have to pedantically alter every line in the BCO because we have this tradition of interpretation that we can stand upon.
I'll just throw out one thing that David Coffin said in our video where we did the roundtable on overtures was that the BCO amendment process has typically been at the end of a lot of conversation about a particular issue where there's been working together to build consensus on what would be fruitful changes. And now a lot of these overtures are being thrown up, when just someone has an idea of what could be better. And I do hope that after this assembly, with so many being sent up, there's a little bit more discretion used by presbyteries and even in some cases individuals to send stuff up without having first done a lot of work to kind of get the word out, talk with others, and try to come with something that already has a lot of people going, this would be a good change.
Yeah, it's consensus building.
Yeah,
and I think it also shows a certain level of pragmatism about the Presbyterian process.
Yes.
And that was another thing that some of the kind of senior voices within the Overtures Committee offered this year, of a pragmatic approach to Presbyterianism of this will not pass.
Yeah.
Right. This won't pass.
Let's not waste everyone's time.
This won't pass the assembly, or this certainly won't pass 2/3 of the presbyteries, even if it does pass the assembly. And so therefore, let's focus our attention and our work on things that can pass and can advance the work of the denomination.
Which is what you want. We want a stability. Like, we don't want like a book of church order that's always changing. So I've committed myself to it and now it's something different. We want something that reflects kind of this confident, stable consensus that we know it's not going to have to change in a year's time.
And I very much hope that some of the overtures that were referred back, or even ones that were answered in the negative, that we will see them again, either next year or in the future, after they've been refined and after a single presbytery has done the work of building consensus and maybe getting together with a few other presbyteries and saying, how can we make this better? How can we develop an overture that actually will pass the denomination and serve the denomination? And so I think some of the overtures that dealt with the diaconal issue fall into that category.
Mm-hmm.
And there may be some people who are frustrated. We even heard it from the floor today of people who said, listen, there are 9, there are 10 overtures that deal with this issue. It's not settled within the PCA. And so there's appetite for talking about it more, but we need to refine the way we're talking about it in a way that's reaching across different groups within the denomination.
And for precedent, I mean, we think about some of the controversies over the last decade, and you can think of, like, for example, the study report that, Tim Keller and Kevin DeYoung worked on same-sex attraction. And there were a number of attempts at overtures. And it took multiple years, but then eventually we kind of came to a stability that everyone was comfortable with. And we haven't talked about it again. And that's just the process that has to work.
Yeah. Did you have any other reflections?
Yeah, I was going to say, we've been talking only positive. There's one part that we're always going to have things that we feel, differently about, like we would have liked to go differently. And I do think when we get to some of the RPR stuff, I think as a denomination, we're still needing to think through how much we want to make people who are far removed from the decisions the ones who are making the decisions, and how much we really want to trust the ones close by. Because as I understand it, one of the key ideas of the way that we work as a denomination is subsidiarity, saying for example, in this particular case, when a presbytery is examining an individual to see whether or not that person is qualified to be ordained, whether his exceptions are appropriate, we need to trust the people who know the person, who, like, the committees are meeting, candidates credentials committee is meeting with them for like a couple of hours, and defer to them except in extraordinary circumstances or except in obvious situations where things. And so here we had a minority report discussion, right, where we are, where there's a question about whether a person held an exception or held a difference that could be an allowable exception related to images of Jesus. And I think the discussion moved from the question of, to what extent should we give deference to the lower courts, which is really what it was about, to what do we think about the second commandment? And that really isn't the discussion we're supposed to be having. At this place, we're supposed to be thinking about that larger question about what we're supposed to empower the lower courts to do and what we're supposed to kind of intervene. And that's something I don't know how, but I would love for us to be able to think how to talk about that better, because I think that's a really important thing that we need to navigate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's bringing into relief for us one of the tensions inherent within Presbyterianism, which is subsidiarity and the process of review and control.
That's right.
That's also a fundamental part of what Presbyterianism means, and no one is rejecting the idea of review and control.
Right.
But for review and control to work side by side with subsidiarity, I think it requires trust. And one of the fundamental vows that every elder in the PCA takes is subjection to the brethren, which is speaking to this issue of trust. But it's hard to define what trust looks like, what trust smells like,
right,
when you're in the midst of a debate or a review of Presbyterian records.
Yep.
Yeah. Speaking of RPR, I would say this assembly rejected attempts to reform RPR. That's
true.
So there were two overtures in different ways that sought to reform RPR.
Yep.
Because RPR has become very long as a report, and there's a lot going on. And there seems to be a desire to shorten what is brought to the assembly, because, and I've been one of them, people pulling things out of RPR to try to address particular matters. And a lot of people feel like we don't know what's going on. We just want to trust the committee, but then the committee's giving us more and more stuff every year. And what do we do about this? And so there were attempts at editing how we do that, and those were both rejected this year. So there's going to need to be some more work in looking into how can we do review and control well.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts that you had?
I have one more, but it's probably better for the end. I don't know if you have anything else, or
what about you, Eric? You were on Overtures. Did that stand out to you in your experience at all?
Yeah, I think it is worth mentioning a little bit of Overtures. We've talked about the sheer number of Overtures that came before us, and so for those of us who've served on Overtures, it was a full day on Monday, a full day on Tuesday. I've served on Overtures before, and the amount of time that we spent together was longer than I've ever spent before. It's kind of the experience afterwards of walking out of the meeting room as if you've been riding in a convertible for 4 hours. You just feel windblown by, Presbyterianism. But what I will say is, number one, the committee was extremely well led by Guy Waters.
Yes, he was amazing.
And I think we can say the same about our moderator for this year, that Mel Duncan did a fantastic job of leading.
High degree of difficulty, right? And he was able to
particularly again with
ClickerGate. That's right.
Everything that was going on. And so I'm encouraged by the resources we have, the human resources we have in the denomination to help lead us through these challenging issues. I will say as well that one of the things that stands out to me from Overtures is one of the very first overtures that we talked about in past was an overture that gave thanks for the professions of faith within our denomination. And I think sometimes in all of the Presbyterianism that we do and all of the jargon and the lingo is we miss the advancement of God's kingdom and the advancement of God's mission through the local church and through things like RUF. And so some of the highlights of this assembly for me were after the assembly passed that overture, taking time to pray in thanksgiving for continued professions of faith in our denomination, and hearing reports from RUF about nearly 100 interns who are going to be placed on campuses that is addressing this very real problem of a leadership pipeline for our denomination.
And I mean, the report from Covenant College, just the encouragement of what God is doing there and the vision they had. You're right. That we don't get into the PCA so we can go to GA, right? We get into the PCA because this is the kind of stuff we're excited about, and seeing it was really encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, that would probably be my biggest takeaway, is that the denomination and what we're doing, there's a lot of really great things to celebrate.
Yeah.
And often that gets overshadowed by online arguments and controversies, and then overtures that are trying to respond to that and fix this or that. But the part of our General Assembly that often gets overlooked, that's kind of the most exciting part, is hearing about what our seminary is doing, our college is doing, what RUF is doing,
Yep.
what M&A is doing, what Mission of the World is doing. And like, there's great ministry happening.
Right. And I would say the other thing, maybe for some of the people who are watching a review or a recap of GA that they wouldn't see, is it's the interactions that we get to have with one another. It's the conversations we have outside the assembly hall or over meals. And one of the things that I heard from multiple people this year was this admission that despite our debates on the floor, what we share in common is 99% of what we think. And the amount that we debate is this thin sliver of 1%. And I think that can get missed sometimes in a review or when we're focusing issue to issue.
I think that's right.
So on Monday night, I went to the Next Gen Forum that was started initially by Harrison Ford, who works with you.
That's right.
And this year he wasn't there, but it was hosted by Will and Derek Rishmawi, and I think it's
Robert
Haslett.
Yep.
Spoke on the sort of next generation crisis of leaders coming up, and Hassler in particular talked about the kind of demographic change coming down the road, and some of the challenges that's going to present for us in terms of membership and finances. And, that's a real challenge that we need to be talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I had a different conversation later on in the overtures, kind of in the back with someone kind of on the other end of the spectrum than me. And he was talking about some of the challenges of churches closing in his presbytery or needing assistance and not being able to find pastors to go there. And he was saying, we need to focus on this. This is a real problem. Yeah. And both of us were like, at that point, it was still overtures meeting, and was like, we're sitting here arguing about stuff that is not that important. It's a lot of fringe stuff. And we really need to stop talking about this stuff and start talking about those mission concerns. And he was like on the same page about that. And that was encouraging to me because it seems like this General Assembly as a whole was kind of let's not argue about those fringe things, and let's try to focus on starting to address our missional challenges ahead of us. So I hope that trend continues.
Yeah. And that's what's encouraging to me, because I think you need to have GAs like this to be able to allow that to come more to the foreground. Like, if we're constantly fighting the next fight and kind of like this anxiety that moves us from one to the other, we won't be able to talk and focus on those things that we really should be talking about and focusing on. And that, like, for me, the fourth, one other thing that I had in my mind was, I thought this was a valuable GA and encouraging GA, but it feels almost like a prologue to me, because like the expectation was we were going to have the 90 overtures, and many of those we sent a few back because we weren't even able to answer. But the reason that we were especially worried was because we have these two big ad interim committees, these study reports that neither of which ended up actually doing a full report.
Yeah.
So there's still going to be this ongoing question. We have a proposed directory of public worship that was kind of talked about. We've seen. And so presumably in Milwaukee, we're going to have to decide, are we going to have a binding directory of public worship? Can we kind of find common ground on that? I'm hopeful. Like, I actually really like the work that they did. I feel like it's theologically robust and it kind of defines who we are as a denomination. But Milwaukee, that's going to be a big conversation.
Yeah. I guess in some ways, actually, I didn't think about this until you said that, but in some ways, both those study committees had a very similar spirit in the work they were doing, which is in many ways to kind of draw some boundaries around where we already are.
That's right.
And identifying things that are kind of beyond us.
Right.
And yes, there's diversity within the PCA, but here's kind of the balance. And both of them, their reports, at least preliminarily,
yeah.
Tired. It's been a long week, but they both were kind of nodding in that direction. And hopefully that will continue to be where they land and come back next time.
Well, and so the second one, just like for those who don't know, like Christian nationalism,
right? Yes. Yeah.
And we could I sense at least these occasional moments where you could tell people wanted to talk more about it.
Yeah.
And there was some anxiety about it that generally didn't actually go much because we really don't have a chance to talk about it right now because it's not yet the full report.
Yeah.
So that, so it's really going to be interesting to me to see
what question. Yeah.
Right.
But I actually think the way that we're carrying over both of those reports is very Presbyterian.
Right. That's true.
So rather than feeling like we can hash it all out in the 2 days of the General Assembly,
Yep.
we're going to go back to our local presbyteries and have those conversations. We now have 6 months or 9 months or 12 months to have a more in-depth conversation around the work that these study committees have done.
Yep.
And I think we owe it to our local churches. We owe it in our presbyteries to begin to have those conversations.
It's a great call.
Robustly.
Yeah.
Well, another dimension that will come at the next assembly we'll have a new recommendation for a coordinator for M&A. That should be here by next year. So there's a number of things that are kind of open-ended.
Right.
We didn't talk a lot about M&A. There was coming in a lot of concerns and questions because they've been dealing with a lot there. It sounds like they're headed in a good direction there. But yeah, so there's a lot of open-ended stuff for the next General Assembly for sure.
Yep.
Any other reflections before we wrap this up? It sounds like we've covered a lot of ground here. So, okay. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. Hopefully this was helpful, just thinking about what's happened this past week or informing you if you weren't able to be there, so you can get a little bit of a window into what's transpired. Be on the lookout for AMR resources. We're going to be continuing to publish on our theological vision in the coming weeks. We'd love to hear thoughts and interactions on that. You can follow us on all the social media, Substack, and we'll be having different people write for us. And we really want to start sharing more about our missional focus and our focus on renewal for our denomination. Thanks for tuning in.